Good evening. Welcome to the last day of Climate Week at the Explorers Club. I'm Alex Moore. I'm the chair of the program, and I'm here to welcome our host and introduce the event. This year we started and ended with environmental journalism. And there is a reason for that. It's because environmental journalism is literally keeping the conversation alive. And without the energy and devotion of environmental journalists who go in far away places and brave a lot of dangers and often don't make it back, we would not be here today discussing the challenges that climate crisis is posing to our ecosystems and our lives. It's our pleasure to welcome Mongabay on their 25th anniversary to discuss these issues. Mongabay has been doing amazing reporting and they're one of the few who are still doing in-depth investigative reporting fearlessly. And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Fernanda Wenzel, who is a staff writer for Mongabay and the host of this evening.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here tonight, and thanks for the Explorers Club for having us. I am Fernanda Wenzel. I am from Brazil, so my English is far from perfect. I'm sorry about that. I am an investigative reporter covering the Brazilian Amazon, and I would like to introduce you for our guests tonight. So, Rhett Butler, the founder and CEO of Mongabay, David Akana, our African program manager, Maria Isabel Torres, our Latin America director, and Willie Schubert, our executive director. Thank you for being here tonight. And also, I want to say thank you for all the Mongabay staff who have worked a lot to put this event together. So if you could please stand for a minute. Holly, Mike, Lucia, Eric, and Alejandro. Thank you. So we are here tonight to talk about solutions journalism, and Mongabay has been doing that for a long time, showing, for example, what things can we learn from indigenous people who are the experts in conservation, and also showing, for example, projects of agroforestry and using a lot of data to do in-depth investigations. And that's a very important moment for us to be discussing solution journalism, not only because climate change is a reality, but also because journalism is in crisis. So we have some recent surveys showing that nearly 40% of people, they don't want to see news anymore. But at the same time, we have other data showing that the same people, they are willing to read some kind of news, and we're talking mostly about positive news. So we, in Mongabay, we believe that's an opportunity to do this kind of stories and to try to make a difference in our world. So that's it from my part, and I want to introduce you to Rhett Butler, our CEO and the founder of Mongabay.
Well, thank you, Fernanda. That was great. I want to thank everyone for coming out. It's wonderful to have a full turnout and and having a sold-out event. So thank you for that. So I'm going to one of the questions that's asked a lot of me, besides where'd my name come from, is what is the origin of Mongabay? So I'm just going to start off by walking us through that, and then hand it off to the rest of the team to talk about our solutions work. All right. Well, maybe first I'll just give a real quick overview of Mongabay in case you're not familiar with it. So Mongabay is a news service that covers issues at the intersection of people and nature in what we call impact geographies. So most of our coverage is in the tropics because we've identified that as a place where there's a great need for our kind of journalism and not necessarily that much journalism being done. We focus, in terms of like what our beats are, this is things like forests, oceans, wildlife, the conservation sector, and frontline communities. We're also expanding in some other areas, but historically those were our main focal points. Our team, we have about 110 staff in about 30 countries and about 1,000 contributing journalists in about 80 countries. We produce written content, audio content, and video content. We are a nonprofit, so we're mostly dependent on grants from foundations and donations from individuals. And we distribute content via our website, social media, and then our content, or especially our articles, are produced under an Open Creative Commons license, so it means anyone can use our stories for free, commercially or non-commercially, and so we have a lot of distribution in some markets via mainstream media. So for example, there's between 60 and 70 mainstream media outlets in Latin America that are using our stories. So it gives us much broader reach. And then in terms of like what this looks like on a map, those are some numbers. So that's staff plus contributors. You can see we're particularly strong in Latin America and Southeast Asia and South Asia. This map is actually about a year old now. Africa has scaled up quite a bit because last year we started Mongabay Africa, which meant we spun off our team, our Africa team into their own bureau. And so that's led by David Akana, who will be speaking later. So Mongabay's origin story. So the inspiration for Mongabay basically came in my childhood. So I had the great fortune of having a mother who was a travel agent and a father who traveled a lot for business. And so my family prioritized travel growing up. And so instead of going to Disneyland, we go to places like Venezuela. And I was always especially fascinated in herps, so reptiles and amphibians. And I knew that the greatest diversity of herps were in the rainforest. So I would try to lobby my parents to take me to the rainforest someday. And so my first intense or real rainforest experience was when I was 12. We went to eastern Ecuador near Yasuni National Park, which is known as one of the most biodiverse places on Earth. And so this is a very beautiful forest. We stayed with a fairly traditional indigenous community. And I had just an amazing time playing with the kids my age, looking for frogs, things like that. I came home, and shortly thereafter, there was a story in the newspaper about an oil spill that had happened on the Rio Napo, upriver from where I had visited. And so what that meant is the area I had visited was now affected by this oil slick. And so I just wondered what had happened to my friends in the forest and the animals. And so that's what moved me from being someone who was into cool frogs to someone who is tracking environmental issues. The thing that actually moved me to action happened when I was 17. So I had an opportunity to go to Malaysia and Borneo, which again is a very diverse place. So it's full of all sorts of great reptiles, amphibians, cool insects, and of course it's best known for the orangutans there. And I just had a remarkable experience where I was sitting by a little natural pool, and a male orangutan passed over my head and turned around and looked at me for a second and then passed on. And so that just left a mark on me. I kept in correspondence with the scientists there, and I learned that forest was slated to be pulped for paper, and today it's an oil palm plantation. And so it went from a forest that looked like that to something that looked like this. And so the destruction of that forest is what inspired me to want to raise awareness about tropical forests and why they're important. And so when I began at the university, I started writing a book about forests. So my major had nothing to do with environment or journalism, but it was my passion. And so I'm a finance economics person, and I just worked on this book on the side. And thankfully, I had a professor who gave me credit, and I had some credit from high school as well, so I was able to finish school a year early. And I spent that year working on the book, and I found a publisher, went through peer reviews, and the publisher came back and said, we're interested in publishing this book, but we're not going to invest the money to put pictures in it. And so to me, that defeated the purpose of what I was trying to do, which is convey the beauty of rainforests and why we should save them. So I thought, well, I don't write this book for money, I wrote it for impact. And so instead of pursuing this what was essentially going to be a textbook, I decided to put the book online so people could read it for free. And I named it after an island off Madagascar. So I wanted to have a unique name, and so I changed the spelling of this island off Madagascar. The reason I chose this place is it's kind of like my idea of paradise. So it's an island that's covered with rainforest. It's home to all sorts of amazing frogs and lizards, but also has lemurs and strange creatures like tenrecs, and it's surrounded by coral reefs and has a large population of humpback whales. And it also had a nice story because the forest had actually been denuded at one point, but it had come back. So it was like this, very positive aspect of this island, that there could be this much diversity on an island that had been logged of all of its large trees. But I wasn't going to run a website for a living, so I moved to Silicon Valley and got a real job. But I kept working on the website nights and weekends, and in mid-2003, I put advertising on the website. Because the site was popular, it started to generate revenue, and so I thought, well, maybe I could quit my job and pursue my passion, and so that's what I did. And one of the first things I did after quitting my job was create a section for children that I had adapted into about 40 languages by native speakers. I started taking pictures everywhere I went, so I wouldn't have a problem with not having photos anymore. And then I started the news service, which is what Mongabay is best known for. So the first several years of Mongabay was great. I eventually hired someone, and there were 2 of us. We worked a lot. People thought Mongabay was a lot bigger than it actually was. But I had all these ideas I wanted to pursue that there was no advertising-based business model for. So I had done a lot of reporting in Indonesia, and I had seen that there really wasn't very good environmental coverage across Indonesia in Indonesian. And one of the big issues in Indonesia is a lot of natural resources degradation is driven by corruption and mismanagement in the agencies and sort of capture by industries. And so I thought, well, journalism is actually an intervention that could help move the needle because it could increase accountability and transparency. And I thought Indonesia could go in a direction kind of like where Brazil went in the early 2000s, where it essentially disaggregated deforestation from economic growth, or it at least undermined that kind of model or that argument. And so I decided to form a nonprofit in order to pursue this. So I created the nonprofit. I managed to get a grant. As soon as I got the grant, I announced that I was going to be doing this thing. And because I had done so much coverage in Indonesia, there was already a lot of awareness of Mongabay, and so people were very eager to join this effort, even though it was kind of going out on a limb. And so I went over, I interviewed a bunch of people, hired the team. We launched the website about 2 months later, and then within a month of launching the website, it was the most popular Indonesian language news service. And so what I brought to the table was I raised the money, but then I just basically handed control over to this group of amazing Indonesian journalists, and they just made this thing a success. Within a couple months, after that, the president of Indonesia was referencing the website, so it really took off. Indonesia is also interesting because it was way ahead of the US in social media adoption, so it was a place where we could test ideas and then bring it back to the global Mongabay. It's also a place where we started doing this distributed model in terms of having contributors that are local contributors who are spread throughout an area. And so we brought all this back to Mongabay, and eventually I began to start to transition Mongabay English to the same model. So I donated all the articles I read to the nonprofit, and then I started to replicate the model in other markets. And so the first was Mongabay Latam in 2016, which is run by Isabel Torres, who's here tonight. Then Mongabay India in 2018, which is English and Hindi. And then we just launched Mongabay Africa, which I mentioned earlier. And so that's kind of what it looks like in terms of our growth trajectory since we became a nonprofit. So it's been steady compound growth. And that's the end. So I'll hand it over to David Akana from Mongabay Africa.
Well, thank you so much, Rhett. When we decided to expand in the African market, we made a conscious decision to be very deliberative in terms of how we do this, and so we decided to be very strategic in our decision making. We did go around and look at a lot of literature and a lot of data out there. And of course, we established a whole lot of conclusions. One of them, of course, is the narrative that you pretty much know about, the African continent, which is that oftentimes when you talk about a continent, it is viewed more from the perspective of, war, hunger, conflict, bad governance, absence of leadership, et cetera, et cetera. So we established that, and it's a whole story that, probably, if it goes back to 100 years, and the media has contributed very significantly to establishing this narrative. So it was important for us to, look at that history and then make a decision in terms of how we want to, expand in the African market. And so we also looked at a lot of literature that has been published. I guess that you obviously may know some of this perhaps better than I guess. But again, if you look at some of the studies that have been done, you'd realize that this particular one was done by one of the lecturers at Stanford University in California. And he did a content analysis of over 250 articles in French and British newspapers and established that when it came to reporting about Africa, for the most part, the kinds of things that would feature social and political instability, hunger, poverty. Those were the kinds of things that you would find in most of the content. And so, obviously because of that, what you've had over time is that more and more, there are people who are questioning the tone, they're questioning, the different angles of media organization. And that's actually, whether that's legitimate or not, but it's a debate that I think we are seeing now in the public space on the continent. Media neutrality has come it's been questioned in a very significant way. And so for us, the question here was, do we just bypass all of these different things that are happening on the continent, or do we take that into consideration in terms of expanding? And so we were very thoughtful. And so what we decided to do, of course, is look at all of that history and actually look at what's also going on the African continent at this point. Those three leaders, maybe the two in military fatigue, are emerging leaders in the Sahelian belt of West Africa. The other gentleman is Paul Kagame, president of Rwanda in the South. What you'd hear them from time to time now say is that Western media is very biased against, coverage of issues on the African continent. Now, again, is that legitimate? I'm not 100% sure. Maybe there is an argument in what they're trying to say. But what's happening over time is that what they are saying is basically driving a whole lot of other, the citizens to question Western media and credibility. It's, obviously there's huge issues with respect to credibility of Western media. And it's not only Western media, I have to say that. But of course, even, a lot of young people who are growing up across the continent, they are all questioning, media content coming in from the West. And so there are several other, competing, strategic currents going on the continent, whereby I think, for the most part, a lot of people now understand exactly the relationship between the extractive industry and the colonial powers that had been before and the sort of role that they're playing today. And of course, all of these different things led us to draw certain conclusions, which is that if we're going to expand in the African market, then we should be really strategic in terms of, our choices. And so that's one of the reasons why we put together a strategy which is underpinned by significant accountability journalism, but at the same time, doing a lot of solutions work. So I know when we talk about solutions journalism, which is central to the new strategy that we've put in place, a lot of people do raise a lot of questions. And again, they are legitimate questions. But the bottom line here is that solutions does not necessarily mean that we're going to go soft. No, on the contrary, we're just going to be more accurate, balanced, and nuanced with respect to the coverage of the continent. And so this strategy is a new one. That's a strategy with the buy-in of senior leadership and all the other colleagues on the continent. We all had consensus, and that's exactly the document that's driving the expansion work that we are doing on the continent at this point. And so we just thought it was a smart decision to go in that direction, in part because it solves a whole lot of problems, right? Think about it. All the negative news that we get, it turns people off. Many, as you might have heard Fernanda mention at the beginning, the news industry is actually facing a crisis in the sense that there are many people who do not want to watch news anymore, in part because it's always all negative. And if we are all talking about, inspiring as many people as possible, as many actors as possible, to take action to address the planetary emergencies, then you ought to find, different ways in which you're going to engage the audience. And so for us, the solutions approach has a lot of benefits in the sense that, on the one hand, not only does it rebalance the news because, again, it's accurate and more balanced, but also it leads to a further re-engagement, it leads to action, and of course, what we are saying is that there is also enhanced trust. I think you might have seen, based out of the data coming from, studies from Oxford University, when you talk about solutions, there's more traction, and we're also seeing that even in terms of our social media engagement. And it also leads to hope, right? And I think that's obviously, it would sound to me, the smart approach to use moving forward. So that's the approach that we have adopted on the continent, and a lot of the work that we're going to be doing moving forward with the very ambitious editorial agenda that we have is going to be in that direction. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of, solution-based stories here and what sort of impact it has had. I think I have just 2 or 3 more slides and I'll be done. We did this story in the DRC that's back in 2021, and it's about, a local Congolese conservationist, Adam Kasinga. He's actually a local guy. He's working in conservation. He has an organization. We did a story about him, profiled him basically, and before that, we had actually published a short on YouTube. And we saw a lot of traction. The good news about this, of course, is that without us saying is also that we're flipping the script with respect to the popular assumption that Africans may not necessarily be good conservationists. But this is, a local guy working on conservation and actually, putting out his heart and soul just to be able to, advance that cause in this country. And so those are the benefits. Also, some of the benefits are that, again, that we don't seek to do. That is, some of the organizations, seeing exactly what he was doing, actually funded him in terms of placing cameras or providing him cameras or infrastructure for him to continue to do his work. So that's great. We've also seen this in Gabon. Again, this is even before we put in place a strategy, and that's, again, these are some of the evidence why we should scale up that approach. We did some work in Gabon, that's northwest, it's not actually northeast, in Gabon, where we actually reported the story of a company that was actually doing, exploiting an intact forest. And the previous regime of President Ali Bongo and the minister at the time visited this location. And the good news, of course, is that they now designated this area as, a protected area. And it is still a protected area. So that's a connection between some of the good work that we do and how much it can lead to policy change. Last one is just in South Africa. So in South Africa, we did a story, and basically it's about a finding from the University of Illinois, and it's a lion localizer. Basically, if you kill a lion maybe anywhere in Botswana and you move it to maybe, New York, you can actually track whatever, you can track, the origin of that particular species based out of the DNA test. And so the South African National Park picked up that story, and they're actually using it to be able to move the anti-poaching agenda forward. So those are the connections between doing positive story and what it could actually lead in real life. So that's what I had for you today. Thank you so much. I'm going to introduce my colleague right now.
I'm a little. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Isabel Torres. I'm a Peruvian journalist based in Lima, and I've been running Mongabay Latam since its beginning 8 years ago. And since we started, one of the values that I appreciate most of Mongabay is that it has given each bureau in Africa, in Latin America, in India, in Indonesia, the possibility, the opportunity to practice a kind of journalism that adapts to each context in order to drive change. Because we are different regions, we have to practice some difference in the terms of doing journalism. So in Latin America, for example, one of our main focuses has been the lack of information that prevents government and private sector accountability. And also, we realized that we need more specific data that help us better understand the changes in our territory. Our territories are changing so fast in so many ways that it's very difficult to keep up, even for us as journalists. So I experienced that myself. 4 years ago, some indigenous leaders started to be killed in Ucayali and Huánuco, those two regions in Peru, that is my country. And we know that in those places there were illicit economies, but we don't know how much, we don't know what's happening, we were concerned, so we asked ourselves what's happening over there. So we used georeference data of more than 2,000 indigenous communities, and we overlapped that information with a data set of coca crops, illegal mining, deforestation, and in some cases of illegal airstrips that were used for narco trafficking. And what we have is that we realize that indigenous communities are surrounded by environmental crimes. Let me show you. Almost 60% of all the indigenous communities that we analyzed are affected by one of these environmental crimes, if not several at once. Here you have the map of Ucayali, that is the region where we started investigation. In yellow, green, and light blue, you have indigenous communities and indigenous communities reserve, and in red, deforestation, and the plains in orange are illegal airstrips used for narco trafficking. So we can see like the big picture of what the indigenous communities are living in those territories. And we have used this kind of methodology for various investigations in different ways. For example, in Colombia, we used that for trying to build some kind of crime maps of the Amazonian, the Colombian Amazon. For example, we were able to find the presence of coca crops and illegal mining in 62% of the protected areas, the protected parks in Colombian Amazon. But also we were able to identify that 35 of 39 municipalities that host the protected areas have presence of illegal armed groups. So that make these two facts showed us the difficulty of protecting these areas and how it's difficult for the government, how it's difficult for the rangers, and why they are so threatened in those territories. And what I want to highlight of these two experiences is that, and let me go to the next one, that we can see this in two different ways, because we are trying to look at solutions too. And this is a way to look at maps with a different, in different way, with different eyes. You can see this is Ucayali. This is a zoom in Ucayali. In the territory, you can see deforestation in red. You can see the coca crops in purple. You can see the illegal airstrips with the plains. But the territory that is well protected are the indigenous territory, and the indigenous communities territory. Around them, working like a buffer zone, is an indigenous community reserve. So we can see that this territory, without environmental crimes, is the one that the indigenous territories, the indigenous communities are protecting. And we are trying also to respect what they want in terms of narrative, because they have said they don't want to be portrayed only as victims. You know, they are playing an active role in protecting these territories. They are trying to protect their homes, putting their lives on the line. And the thing is that we are trying to show that with those maps could give us the opportunity to showcase also those examples. So I want to highlight that by using this methodology, several indigenous organizations and communities have asked for this information, because that helps us to support their claims, because they have been denouncing this situation for many, many years, and this information helps us to support these claims. And also that information gives us the opportunity to find new places, new hotspots of environmental crimes. So we have gone to the field, we have made new stories, and those stories have alerted authorities to open legal proceedings in those territories, to carry out police operations in those territories. So we are seeing really a real-world impact from these maps. The second thing I want to mention relates to this gap of information is we are asking if the state is going to be a good environmental regulator of these activities in the Amazon. And spoiler alert, the answer is no. So we started to know that for sure, doing an investigation, an in-depth investigation about the environmental impacts of the oil industry in 4 Amazonian countries. We did it in Colombia, in Ecuador, in Peru, and in Bolivia. And we asked the governments of those countries for public information about all the sanctions that they have done to these governments, to these oil industries between 2011 and 2021. So we got no response from the Bolivian government, despite our insistence. The Ecuadorian government said that they can tell us how many spills they have counted, but not which companies are responsible, and whether if they have sanctioned any of those companies. And Colombia only gave us partial information, and only Peru sends complete sanctioned data. So even so, we were able to find that there was around 282 sanctions against 72 oil companies, but the most disturbing is the lack of transparency of these governments. And we have done this kind of investigation, and every time government fail to give us the information that we are asking for them. Then we continue with this in-depth investigation, this time focusing in environmental liabilities from the oil industry. So we ask again these governments to give us public information about environmental liabilities on the ground. And what we have done is georeference all these liabilities on the ground, and we identified and georeferenced 8,000 contaminated sites. More than 6,000 of these liability have not fully remediated. Also, more than 600 liability overlap with 50 indigenous territories and 15 protected areas in the Amazon. And nearly 3,000 kilometers of the pipelines that we also georeference cross 65 natural reserve and 140 indigenous territories. So in the map, you can see Ecuador. You can see in yellow and in blue the indigenous territories and protected areas, and then you can see all the liabilities georeferenced by us in red and with this oil drop. So if we overlap in those territories also environmental crimes, you can really imagine how pressure is the situation against indigenous communities. So it helps us to have a better idea of what's happening. And I'm going to run with the last huge lack of information in Latin America. That is something that is very concerning, and it's the situation about environmental defenders. The thing that we ask ourselves is, what's happening with the killing of the environmental defenders? Are some of those killings that are increasingly, year after year, being brought to justice? Spoiler alert again, no. We gather information from 58 Amazonian indigenous leaders, and of those 58, only 50 remain unpunished. We have also built some database about environmental defenders that are facing legal procedures, and also environmental defenders that have disappeared in Mexico since 2006. So finally, I think that the idea is that we're trying to have to be a hub of information. This information leads us to new investigation, help us to find stories of resistance of indigenous communities, and also help us to promote action. And without information, we cannot think in solution that last that could be really solution for our region. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody. I'm going to go on a bit of a speed run through this presentation, just because I want to make sure we have enough time for Q&A. My name is Willie Schubert. I'm the executive editor for Mongabay. I'm going to be speaking also about our data work, because I think as the examples that Isabel just showed, is that data is fundamental for decision-making on remote places around the world, and I'm going to give you some examples of that today. So Mongabay believes that journalism can be a solution in and of itself to halt deforestation. And so one of our big goals as a news outlet is to produce timely journalism that can create cases where deforestation is stopped before it's had an irreversible impact. And I'm going to walk you through one of those examples today, and how we're using not just the enterprising tools of going out and asking governments to give us information and get that on the record, but using satellite information and the vast amount of data about the environment that does exist to identify areas that are concerning for deforestation. And the reason for that is because deforestation is getting harder to hide, and ignorance is not a viable excuse. And I think we're seeing that clearly with the debates around the EU deforestation regulation, is that these types of practices that we've pioneered over many years are being turned into regulation and laws that can be used to hold people accountable. And one of the first examples of that in a case study is also from Peru. And I know we just looked at a lot of data from Peru, so I'm going to show you a little bit more, but not too much more. There are millions and millions of places that are having these deforestation alerts every year. And we're going to look at one specific little pink patch of them in the northeast of Peru, and tell you a bit about what's the story behind that little pink patch, so that it's not so abstract. So that data is from 2013. In 2014, there was a company called United Cacao that did an IPO to try and raise money to create what would become the largest sustainably run chocolate venture in Latin America. Unfortunately, despite, and that's part of the solution story. People are proposing a solution. That's a problem that needs to be solved. Unfortunately, when it's predicated on a lie, it's not a real solution. And that's a transparency issue that Mongabay and journalism can address. And so you saw Rhett's story early on about what happens on the ground and being inspired by that. We saw what was happening from the satellite. We go and we verify it on the ground and see what's actually going on. And this area that had been claimed to be a degraded forest that was decades old, not a primary rainforest, found out that wasn't true, that it was a land that was used by indigenous communities, and that it had been cleared all at once right before this IPO. And so when that information came out that we broke it, there was a whole constellation of people who took action. And that's really the other critical thing about solutions journalism, is that you're creating usable information and to inform action. I think Isabel and David both talked about this. So what happened afterwards? One thing was that The Guardian and international media and local media published about it, created an uproar that ultimately caused the stock exchange that IPO had happened on to delist the company and stop continued investment. A whole group of scientists were able to back up Mongabay's assertions. Civil society came together and said, what they're saying is true, and verified it with local communities. And because of that, the Peruvian government actually arrested the local company, the subsidiary in Peru, arrested people, fined them, and told them that they had to stop. And so this took years to happen. This is that story of the unraveling. And one of the things is that it created a precedent. That court case created a precedent that said that satellite imagery, the prosecutor said, this is the history in pictures of our forest. But what's the conservation outcome of that? I know we're here in Manhattan right now. And so the amount of land, it was 100,000 hectares. That's 16 Manhattans. That was avoided deforestation. That's 72 billion miles driven. Like, these are real impacts from avoided deforestation. And this is really the critical challenge in forest conservation right now, is how do you halt the advance of commercial agriculture into primary forests? And so what's changed since then? That was 10 years ago. We're now doing this in real time. We're getting updates every 2 weeks. We're assessing this information, and we're using high-resolution satellite imagery to find these patterns of expansion, of agricultural expansion into rainforests. And one of the examples, which was a regional story, is about Mennonites. And you may know Mennonites, they have colonies all over Latin America, and they're in the US. And one of the things is like, solutions journalism is about identifying the problem. And sometimes these problems are hundreds of years old. I think David referenced this as well. This type of settler colonialism has been happening for 500 years. And we're using these real-time satellite alerts from Global Forest Watch. We get, we filter this information every 2 weeks. We try to find these patterns. And we can spot things like, oh, there's a new bridge that's gonna help expand this plantation area in this buffer zone of a protected area. We can spot that, make that news. It's an alert, it goes out. But we can also go and visit, talk to those communities, find out why are they going there? What are their incentives? Who's paying for that? Are they paying taxes? And we can see that this is a pattern that's happening all throughout Latin America. And so when we follow these things, these problems, for a long period of time, we get tips. We build trust. We have credibility. When the government in Suriname, which is another Amazon country, which is often off the radar because they don't speak Spanish or Portuguese, they speak Dutch over there, so it's kind of a blank spot in a lot of people's minds. They planned to turn 1% of that country into plantations, 500,000 hectares, 5 times the size of the United Cacao. And that was going to be spearheaded by pilot projects from Mennonites. We revealed this information from a leak. Oh, I should go back. What ended up happening was after we revealed that, there was a big uproar from civil society. That initial pilot project got canceled, and then there was a court injunction against the larger project. And if you think about like these goals to halt deforestation, these international commitments that a lot of governments have, 500,000 hectares is measurable on a global level. And that's from one story that impact came from. And so, I know we're into the Q&A time. I want to make sure we have enough Q&A time. But thank you all for coming today. And I look forward to chatting.
Thank you for sharing these very impressive stories with us. And we have 10 minutes for questions. I have some very good questions from the audience here. And I think we can start with this one. Maybe David and Maria could take this one. As Willie showed us, satellite imagery can be very helpful to do investigations in the rainforest, but it's still so important to have reporters on the ground. So I'd like to ask you, what kind of risks these reporters are facing now doing these investigations in Latin America or in the African continent? If you could keep it short, I really appreciate that.
Of course, yes. I think that, as you know, in Latin America is now the most dangerous place to exercise environmental activism in the world. So the situation is very, very difficult for journalists, but also for indigenous communities, as we have seen in those maps. So for journalists in Mexico, in Colombia, now in Peru, and also in Ecuador, it has been very difficult to arrive to some indigenous communities, to some protected areas. So we have developed protocol of security to try to be really, really sure that nothing is going to happen to the journalists, but also we are trying to make sure that when the journalists publish the story, nothing is going to happen to the indigenous community sources, because finally we are living in the cities, but they have to stay in those kind of territories surrounded by these environmental crimes. So we are trying to handle the best way these threats, and I think the satellite data help us a lot trying to go to some places in the safest way and trying to protect our sources.
No, absolutely. It's the same thing, Fernanda. If you look at most of the countries on the continent, they rank pretty low in terms of media freedom. So basically, you'd understand that it is pretty hard to be able to, go out, send journalists to some of these difficult areas to do their work. But I think the most important thing, of course, is that we do have protocols in place in the same way, like you said, and we do have very, solid safety procedures that allows us to. Yeah, basically we do have safety procedures that allows us to be able to ensure that we're protecting the journalists so that they continue to be there to get the stories out and not disappear.
Thank you. Maybe the next question Willie and Rhett could take though. And I'm very curious about this response. So what's next for Mongabay?
Sure, so I could start out with that. So we started, 2 years ago we published our 2030 strategic plan, which basically lays out a roadmap for the next several years. But one of the main areas for one of the pillars of that is our expansion into different geographies and topics. And so Mongabay Africa is one of the first things, and so we've already made a lot of progress on that. We'd like to eventually have a Mongabay Brazil. So we have Brazilian staff, but we don't, if we establish a bureau, it positions us to scale up and do a lot more. Maybe Willie can take, let's just say we have a lot in the works, but maybe you should talk about the data.
Yeah, I'm happy to, I think a lot of the examples that we've shown today illustrate the power of data and visualization to reveal truths that are difficult to identify without that type of information. And so it is a big part of what we want to continue to expand upon. I think the other big change that Mongabay is going through is recognizing that solutions to environmental problems are often interconnected. And you can't look at a single issue like climate change or biodiversity loss in isolation from each other. And so we've been much more focused on, there's science on what are described as planetary boundaries. We helped launch a website this week called the Planetary Health Check, which highlights the science of Johan Rockström and really says, okay, you want to electrify transportation that has an impact on communities in mining zones. Maybe you shouldn't use an EV Hummer, with that mineral. Like, there are trade-offs in all of these choices, and getting people to take a global perspective on an interconnected crises is really the challenge of the next few years for Mongabay, is leveraging this local reporting that is often so important for trust in the veracity and credibility of the information, because you can see that it's real, but connecting it to these often more abstract global processes that are through lines through all of our stories. So that's really our big challenge as a newsroom, is connecting global to local. And for us, you can't do it without regional. And that's why we have these bureaus.
Yeah, and I'll just add one more thing. So another thing that's a major area of expansion for us is ensuring that there are opportunities for frontline journalists to do this reporting. So that means both having opportunities to get paid and earn a livelihood, but also upskill. So these opportunities to actually do reporting in order to build your portfolio and also learn new skills. And so 2 years ago, we launched a fellowship program, which we are now expanding. And then we also have things like workshops and other capacity building things as well. So that's kind of another major pillar.
Yeah, this is a little bit of a side. I'm going to take maybe 15 seconds. But, Dave and I, we haven't seen each other in person in 10 years, but we've been working together for 15 years. And we did a lot of training of environmental journalists in the Global South to create a livelihood for people. And the reason why both of us are working for Mongabay and not doing that anymore is because there's a churn in journalism. It's very hard to stay in this profession. And without a publisher like Mongabay that will pay people to do the work, those people will leave to go to a different profession. And we're just going to be training entry level forever. And so Mongabay creates a credible pathway for people to make a livelihood doing environmental journalism by being a publisher.
Thank you. So the next question, I think it's a big dilemma, because we know that as reporters and editors, you have to give some hope to people, to our readers, but at the same time, it's our duty to keep showing the wrongdoings. So I don't know if David or Maria want to take this one, but how do you balance these two things in your day-to-day job?
Well, I've always said that our role as a fourth estate remains non-negotiable. We ought to know that our responsibility, journalism, we know exactly what we have to do as journalists, which is to hold people in power to account, and that's exactly what we're going to have to do. And by the way, I have to say that accountability stories are also solution stories, because when you hold people to account and handle the burden of corruption, poor governance, and all of that, it has a lot of the ripple effects are immense, isn't it? The resources are then going to be used to lift up people out of poverty, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a good thing to do. And I think that also informs the overall thinking around solutions journalism. But of course, I do believe that if you do have a possibility of profiling, people who are spending all their time working to either, restore marine ecosystems across the coast of Africa, Asia, or Latin America, if they're doing some great work, show that. If governments put in place new policies that go in the direction of either protecting the environment, show that as well. And so for me, finding that balance remains a constant. That to me is a sustainable approach to use moving forward.
No, I think David explained it, and we are trying to keep balance because the audience is asking for that balance. We really need to do these kind of maps. We need to show how the threats are for indigenous communities, but as I have said, we can see those maps with other eyes, in different ways, and we can showcase resistance, we can showcase what people are doing on the field, because that's something that's also happening. And if people know that there's a solution, they can ask the authorities for those solutions, because if you only inform about problems, what are you going to ask to the governments? So there are solutions that are working, so ask for those solutions to the government and to the authorities.
I have one point on this that I think really builds on what Maria Isabel is saying, is that, she gave an example earlier about oil spills in Ecuador, or in the Amazon. And this is a thing that inspired Rhett to get Mongabay from the beginning. The government's solution to that is find the companies. So really the solutions journalism is about where are you starting your questions? Is that working? How is that working? You can find these companies, they're finding them. How many of them actually paid those fines? Very few. Yeah. So is that a solution? Is finding the solution? Actually, those are accountability stories. They're also solution stories. It's about where you start your questioning.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry, but we have run out of time. But thank you a lot for being here tonight. It was a pleasure. And please go to Mongabay website, look what our amazing reporters are doing on the ground. We also have a newsletter, which is free if you want to sign it. And we have podcasts as well. We have Mongabay Newscast, we have Mongabay Latam, and Mongabay Explorers in podcast. So please check it out, our work. And if you have any question, we will be around now to talk with you. Thank you.